How's it going, everyone? I love doing these because it seems like every other week, whenever I record this on Zoom, I go through it. First take always goes really great. Now I realize I forget to hit record. So that happened again. But that's all right. You'll get hopefully an even better version of what I did already by myself here in this room. But I'm thankful that you're able to join me at this time. And of course, we're going over the 5 facts of the resurrection. We've actually already gone over all 5 facts. Of course, the first one was that Jesus was crucified. Secondly, the disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead. Thirdly, Paul was converted miraculously, goes from being persecutor of the church to all of a sudden being, one of the greatest preachers in the church and willing to suffer for what he's preaching. And he claims that that great transition, that transformation was because he had a personal encounter with Jesus. And also the same with Jesus's brother James. James is a brother of Jesus, skeptic. We see that in the Gospels. And all of a sudden he goes from being skeptic of his own brother to being a leader in the Jerusalem church in the first century. And that's because in 1 Corinthians 15, we see that one of the people Jesus revealed himself to in his risen state was James. And so that's the first 4 facts. The fifth one was the empty tomb. And we talked about that 2 weeks ago when we saw that even Jewish sources, they're trying to explain away the empty tomb. In other words, they're not refuting that the tomb was indeed empty. They're trying to say, well, the disciples stole the body, and are actually, accidentally confessing to the empty tomb. That's really compelling and really interesting. And so with all that, we have these 5 powerful facts. And what we're going to look at today is just kind of some alternate theories. We look at all 5 of these facts, and to me, and everybody has to make their own decision, and I get that. But to me, I look at all these 5 facts, and it just seems like the most logical conclusion is Jesus rose from the dead. And it's almost too simple of an explanation, and maybe that's why we don't want to believe it. It's simple but profound. And if you are closed, if your mind is closed to a miraculous worldview, of course, you're never going to believe it. But when you look at the facts, really, the simplest explanation for all of this is that Jesus rose from the dead. I think we're going to see that as we kind of explore some of these other theories. And so what are some of these theories? And I just want to kind of bring out a few of them here briefly with you at this time. And so we have legend theories, and we have fraud theories, and we have the wrong tomb theory and apparent death theory. And these are kind of the 4 categories that we're going to look at briefly here today. And so let's just start off by looking at the legend theory. Legend theory, it makes some assumptions. It assumes that the story grew, for starters, right? You don't get a legend overnight. I know William Lane Craig says it takes about 2 generations for a legend to grow. But you don't get a legend overnight. And certainly the original story with the legend, right? It's different than the story that you now have, today. Legends evolve over time. And if you go back and you look at what the original stories were, chances are if it's a legend, it's going to be a lot different than what the story is now, because legends evolve, right? So the assumption is that the story about Jesus and his resurrection, it grew over time. And then secondly, it's just that. It was just a story, is what some people would say. And they'd even go so far to say, well, the apostles didn't even intend us, or the writers of the New Testament didn't intend for us to take these things literal. It's a non-historical genre of literature, is what they would say. And finally, it's a variation of other myths and other religions. In other words, go and look at Greek mythology, and there's so much, so many parallels between these mythological gods and the account of Jesus. All the disciples did is they just ripped off those stories and put them to this guy, Jesus, and here you go. We have Christianity. Well, let's just kind of explore some of those things. So first off, just looking at the idea that the story grew, that's really not consistent when you look at what we've talked about. Again, a legend, it grows over time. So you go back and you look at the original message that was being preached, and it should be different than what we have today. But in the case of the resurrection, you can trace back the resurrection message to the original contemporary eyewitness disciples themselves. It was the same. And we even have Peter in Acts 2, 50 days later. He's preaching. that Jesus is risen from the dead and sitting at the right hand of God. This wasn't something that it developed over time, but it was something that the disciples were preaching from the beginning. And we already established that when we said in one of our facts, the disciples believed Jesus was risen from the dead, right? And they were willing to die for that. Also, Paul came to Christ through an encounter with the risen Jesus, right? This wasn't a legend, but Paul himself, a first century Jew, he went through this drastic change, and it was because he claimed to have encountered the risen Jesus. And the same applies to James, the brother of Jesus. And so when we look at these things, what I want us to get right from the get go is that a mere assertion is not evidence that that assertion is true. When somebody makes a claim, we sometimes scurry and we feel like I have to prove and shoot down that claim that that person is making. But actually, when somebody makes a claim, the burden of proof is on them. If somebody's going to say that Christianity and Jesus rising from the dead is a legend, they have to provide evidence. How did that legend begin? How did it develop over time? How is it different than the original story? They have to provide that evidence. Now, we want to be able to counter, whatever assertions are being made, but whenever somebody makes a claim, first give them time and ask them to explain why they believe that. And sometimes they'll reveal to us that they haven't thought it through as much as maybe they should have, and that's okay. That's why we have conversations and we talk about these things. But when we look at a legend, some people want to say, "Hey, story about Jesus is just a story." But that doesn't account for the empty tomb, does it? When you have secular sources, the Jewish sources, trying to explain away the empty tomb, they clearly, the empty tomb wasn't just a story. That's something the Jews felt they had to account for. It accounts for the resurrection, but not the empty tomb. But a story wouldn't have convinced Paul. And we know that because it seems to some extent that's all Paul believed, the resurrection to be, just a story, right? There was no validity to it. Jesus himself was a blasphemer, but Paul, he was converted. Why? Because he claimed to have seen Jesus. He claimed to have been confronted by Jesus, a personal encounter with Jesus. Again, same for James. We're going to keep going back to the 5 facts that we've established. We keep falling back on it. But then finally, there's evidence, in the writings themselves that, you can see that they were meant to be seen as historical, that the writers didn't want us to take it as being non-historical. And certainly people in the first century, they would have been able to distinguish between what's historical and what's not. And all accounts show that Christians, hey, this was a historical account of things that have happened. But even when you look at Acts chapter 2, it doesn't seem like the apostles wanted us to take the resurrection accounts as, being non-literal. When you have Peter saying, hey, look at the tomb of David. The tomb of David is still with us to this day. And he says, now look at Jesus. His body hasn't seen corruption, right? He's drawing this parallel and he's trying to get them to see David's body, his literal body is still with us now. It's rotting. You can open up the tomb. It's still there to this day. And he's saying Jesus isn't like that. I don't know how much more clear you could get if you were wanting your audience to take the message literal than actually pointing to a dead body and saying Jesus's body isn't like this. It didn't see corruption. And we even have a psalm prophesying that his body wouldn't see corruption in Psalm 16. And so the idea that it's just a story, particularly when you see the disciples, again, they died for what they were preaching. To them, it wasn't just a story. It just doesn't hold up well. It doesn't account for the evidence that we have. And finally, the response of early critics, they didn't see it as a story. Again, the tomb, they felt a need to account for the tomb, didn't they? And they were constantly trying to stop this Christian movement or disprove it. It was a real thing. It was a real problem for them, and they didn't see it merely as a story, as they realized people were believing it. Finally, you have combination of religious myths, right? This idea that, okay, we're going to take these myths and there's parallels between all these past, mythological stories and Jesus. They must have ripped it off, right? But when you actually look at the evidence, you begin looking at, what's, supposed to be parallels between the accounts of Jesus' resurrection and, Greek mythology or whatever it may be, the accounts are really unclear and the parallels just aren't there. Many scholars, they say, no, these aren't parallel accounts. In fact, you don't really get the first clear parallel. It's Adonis. You don't get the first clear parallel of a god, dying and rising again from the dead until 150 AD. That's 100 years after Jesus had lived and the events that took place around him had happened. And so you're left with stories like you may have heard of the Greek god Osiris. Osiris was supposedly said to have been a guy who was killed. His body was chopped up into 14 pieces in Egypt. And it's said that this goddess, Isis, she gathered all his body parts together, except she was only able to find 13 of them. And what she did is she gathered all his body parts together, brought him back to life, and made him god of the underworld, god of the dead, basically. And what's unclear about it is it doesn't say anything about an earthly resurrection. It just says that he's, given life and made God of the underworld. It doesn't really compare to what's going on with Jesus, at all. Where Jesus, he's the Prince of Life. I mean, he has the authority to lay his life down and take it up again. In the story of Osiris, he's not even the hero of his own story, and certainly, he's only got 13 pieces of his body. It just doesn't add up. But you're left with accounts like that, and you're forced to say, well, that's parallel if you're going to subscribe to this kind of view. But also, when you look at other religions, their accounts lack evidence. When you talk about the Prophet Muhammad, the earliest account of miracles that we have for Muhammad are 75 years after he died. And they're in sources that many Islamic scholars would say are unreliable, untrustworthy. And so it's easy to see, 75 years later, it's easy to see how maybe the story grew over time and how legend could apply to such things as those stories. They're easy to oppose. But even just considering all of that, don't allow yourself to get distracted. Because when you look at these other accounts in Greek mythology, they can't account and they can't explain the historical data that we have for Jesus' resurrection. Even if you look at all these other, even if there's like a total parallel and it was proved to be false, you can't just say, okay, therefore Jesus' resurrection didn't happen. You're still left with the data that the disciples believed it, that Paul was converted, James was converted, the empty tomb. You still have to account for those things. And so if we're ever having these types of conversations, don't allow yourself to get distracted, because sometimes these arguments that we engage in, they miss the point. And so let's keep the main thing the main thing. And so that's kind of a brief introduction to, legend theories. But then there's something called fraud theories. And, basically is made up of this, either the disciples lied or stole the body, or someone else stole the body. If the disciples didn't do it, somebody did it, right? So let's just kind of look at this real quick. The disciples, it's said, again, one of the facts that we've established is the disciples, they believed in the resurrection. And so you're telling me the disciples, they died saying that Jesus rose from the dead, when all along they knew he didn't rise from the dead. In fact, they're the ones that stole the body. That just doesn't add up. It doesn't explain the evidence. But even looking at that, it really misses the point, because this explanation, it only focuses on the empty tomb. It's only trying to explain the empty tomb. But Paul, he wasn't convinced because of the empty tomb. In fact, would we be convinced if, the tomb of Joseph Smith was empty today? Would we all just, flood to be Mormons? No. And when you look at the gospel accounts, I think the only apostle, if I remember correctly, the only apostle convinced by the empty tomb was the apostle John. All the others, they were really confused by it. They weren't sure what to make of it. And when you look at Paul, he wasn't converted because of the empty tomb. He's converted because of an appearance, not an empty tomb. And it's the same thing with James. Had nothing to do with empty tomb, but it had everything to do with Jesus appeared to me. And so if you're going to subscribe to this view, this explanation itself isn't enough to account for the facts that we know. You have to bring in another explanation with it. If you're not going to believe Jesus rose from the dead, when you begin to use multiple theories and make them work together, that's when the argument gets really weak. Um, and so again, people can't just make a claim. They have to give their burden of evidence. This is interesting. Why am I showing a picture of Richard Nixon? There's this guy named Charles Colson who's sitting next to him. I have this quote in the book that I'm kind of taking you guys through called "The Case for the Resurrection," but it's a quote by Charles Colson, who was an accomplice in Watergate. Some of you may remember that, a huge American scandal. Go look it up on Wikipedia. We're not going to go over it right now, but he ended up becoming essentially a preacher, right? And so listen to this quote as he ties Watergate and kind of the lies and deception going on there to the disciples and their situation. He says Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up perpetuated by the closest aides to the president of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to their president. One of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence, that is, testified against Nixon, as he put it, to save his own skin. And he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks, and then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now, the fact is that all that those around the president were facing was embarrassment, maybe prison. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. You see a clear example in history, right, of deception and lies, and the story fell apart in 2 weeks. And hardly anything was on the line compared to the apostles. But the apostles, they were faithful to what they preached to the point where they were willing to die for it. I think that's really compelling and interesting. And finally, again, someone else stole the body. Again, Paul's conversion was based on appearances, James 2, as well as all the disciples. It was based on appearances, really had very little to do with the empty tomb. The empty tomb just helps our faith. It does help the story, but it wasn't, the original thing that led them to believe. It was appearances. And so again, that's why we say at best, it only questions the cause of the empty tomb. It doesn't deal with the whole story. And so then you're left with, certain explanations that I think are really kind of laughable. You got the wrong tomb. Again, it doesn't account for the appearances. It misses the point. And again, it's this idea that, the apostles, they went to the wrong tomb. I mean, how silly is that? Okay, go to the right tomb. But there's no sources that give this explanation, at least early on. Today, you might have people that say this, but there's no sources early on that tried to explain away the evidence by saying that the disciples went to the wrong tomb. And then finally, when you look at the burial of Jesus, it says that he was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, right? And so we understand that the location of the tomb was probably well known. But also, if they did go to the wrong tomb, all it would take for the Jews is to just exhume the body and present it before the people, and okay, case closed, it's over. But that never happened. So really, look at explanations like this, and it's kind of laughable, to be honest. And finally, you're left with the apparent death theory. And so I have up there, JAMA, or however you want to pronounce that. But that's actually, it stands for, I don't want to mess this up. So let me find, it's the Journal of the American Medical Association. When we talk about apparent death theory, it's this idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. And so he went into the tomb and, he fell asleep, was in a coma, and then he woke up. And so this is how people try to explain away the resurrection, right? But when you're talking about, the death of Jesus and crucifixion, it really medically, it would contradict everything that has been done as far as medical research to this day. For instance, we know not just that he was crucified, but he was also whipped and scourged. That's what they used to do to everybody that was crucified. And it's interesting, when they would whip and scourge somebody, they would do it repeatedly, and it was meant to be excruciatingly painful, and it would rip and tear the skin as there was pieces of bone attached to the end of the whip, and it would tear into the back, and then it would also start tearing into the back muscles themselves, to the point where he'd be bleeding like crazy. I think part of the idea was to make it so it was uncomfortable for him to put his back on the cross. And so even just doing this, there's things going on here in the whipping that were capable of killing him there. But then on top of that, he had nails driven through, his feet and his hands. And here it says that the driven nail would crush or sever the rather large sensoromotor median nerve. The stimulated nerve would produce excruciating bolts of fiery pain in both arms. One person described it like if you took a pair of pliers to crush that nerve that we have, we call it the funny bone. But if you took a pair of pliers and use it to crush that's how he describes the pain that Jesus was going through. But what they found is that the leading cause of death when you would be crucified would actually be asphyxiation. In other words, you'd suffocate to death. And the reason for that is because when you'd be on the cross, you'd want to take the pressure off of your feet, the nails in your feet. And so you would lift yourself up. And by lifting yourself up, it's harder to exhale. And so they would have to kind of let themselves down and then lift themselves back up. And what would happen is that they would lose the strength to do this over the day, and they finally would just give up, and they would suffocate to death. This was the leading cause. But as they're going up and down, the first few times that Jesus would do this, the nails would rip through his flesh until it finally hit a bone, and he could settle, the nail would settle on a bone. And so this is an extremely graphic, horrible, excruciatingly painful thing that's going on here. And again, the leading cause of death would have been, that he would suffocate. And so what they would finally do a lot of times, because they realized that this is how they would die, that's why they would break their legs, because they can no longer lift themselves up and down. And so ironically, when the Romans would go through and break their legs, we remember reading about that in the Gospels, when they would do that, it was an ironic way of having mercy on the person on the cross, because it meant a quicker death. They wouldn't have to sit there and suffer for hours on end. They would crush their legs and then they would suffocate. That's why they would do that. But we remember that Jesus, he was already dead. So they didn't break his legs, and all they did is they stabbed him in the side, and water and blood came out. But you look at all of that, they stabbed him in the side, and then him hanging there on the cross. The Romans, it was their job to make sure these people were dead. It's really highly, highly unlikely. And they say that it would basically contradict, and it would be at odds with modern medical knowledge to say that Jesus, survived that. It's really just impossible is what it is. And so you look at this and we say, okay, well, what if he did? What if his heart was still beating and he was put in the tomb? They didn't know he was dead. There's this guy named, he's a German scholar named D.F. Strauss, and he actually was a critic. He was trying to prove the resurrection wrong. And one of the theories he was using was like a hallucination theory, that they hallucinated and saw the resurrected Jesus. And we won't go there now, but it's equally as ridiculous. But his critique was that how is it, let's suppose he did survive, how is it that, he's got messed up feet after nails going through him and messed up hands? He supposedly gets up, rolls that big stone away all by himself. And then not only that, on his nail-scarred feet, he walks blocks until he finally arrives at the, feet of the apostles. And supposing that he's even able to do that, would the apostles have concluded, hey, he's raised from the dead? he's Lord, he's Prince of Life, as they see this graphic and traumatized Jesus. It's a stretch to say that something like that could have happened, to say the very least. It's obviously ridiculous to say at that point that he would be alive. Well, barely he'd be alive, but he wouldn't be glorified or be somebody that you want to fall down and worship. It wouldn't have led this giant movement. And I found that interesting. It's called Strauss's critique. But then again, even if you look at all these and consider all these things, look again at Paul's conversion. Yes, he witnessed and had a personal encounter with Jesus, but it wasn't this marred, beat up, bloodied, beaten to a pulp Jesus. It was Jesus in this glorified state. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He was blinded by that light. It was Jesus in a glorified state. And that is what led, according to Paul, to his conversion. So you look at these things, we kind of just looked briefly at them. But you look at them, what you find is that they just don't do a very good job of explaining the facts. And so I hope that what you got from this is maybe an example of just falling back on the facts. Memorize these facts. And when we're talking about Jesus being risen from the dead, you can tell somebody, hey, are you aware of the 5 facts of resurrection? And when they try to come up with other theories, you fall back on the facts. What's the best explanation of these facts? And what you find is the most logical, ironically simple explanation of the facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. That's all I have for you guys today. And I hope you have a good rest of your day with your families and a good evening. And we'll see you next time.